Well, hello there. So, what the heck's going on? Let's see. Let's describe kind of the signal path because it's a little bit complicated, but once you get it, you get it. You plug into whatever you want to hear in terms of the preamp. So, right now I've been using the Triple Giant. Got the Egnator here on standby. I could plug into a head and just load it down with the Rivera, but right now what's happening is I'm going from the Triple Giant into the VHT, and this is where it gets a little bit unconventional because I'm using the VHT simply to get some additional power tube, fullness. I can use these presence and depth controls that sound really good, and it makes the preamp come a little bit more organic and alive, versus more of a stomp box kind of sound, right? So once I come out of the VHT, it goes into the Rivera, the Rock Crusher, which then I'm using in full attenuation mode. So make sure the attenuator is on, and then set to the proper ohmage for the output of the VHT. So that's sending, speaker level output of 8 ohms. Set it to 8 ohms there. The equalization things don't make as much of a difference at that setting, the studio setting. So when I turn it to studio, it's fully attenuated. I don't need to use a cabinet at that point. If I set it to these other settings, then you need to actually have a speaker cabinet attached to the Rock Crusher. But at this level, it's fully loaded. The line output is controlled. The level is controlled here. So it's being sent out of their Rivera. The line level output is then going into my rack via the Rocktron rack interface. Okay, so that thing is doing a million things. It recently kind of died on me. I had to have it serviced, and I was freaking out because if it did, the guy couldn't fix it. It's like, okay, I got to get a splitter because it does 1 in, 5 out split. It's got a buffer if you need it. I don't need it. But yeah, so it's taking the input and splitting it 5 ways. It feeds 3 of my devices, and I have an additional output that I'm using and keeping it the dry output, which then all of that stuff goes into the stereo line mixer that's in the rack interface. It's a dual mix 1, mix 2 interface. So mix 1 has 4 stereo input channels. Mix 2 has 4 stereo input channels. And what I've found that works really good for me is I keep the dry signal out of the splitter and I run it into mix 2. But because it's a TRS, it's a stereo input, and these are mono outputs, I need to put an adapter on my dry line output to get into the mix 2 stereo input, which basically sends dual mono to that stereo channel that I'm using for mix 2. The other devices, the 3 stereo devices, are being fed into mix 1. And that way I can use mix 1 to, control the amount of effects level overall, all the effects running in parallel, and I can control the dry level here and get a balance between wet and dry. It's basically a wet dry wet kind of system in like in-ears form, so that's really cool. And then this interface also has, when I was playing live, balanced DI outputs. So I ran those straight to the house. It's got a little switch for hot pin swapping between 2 and 3 if you need that feature. It's got a cab emulator built into it, that circuit. It's bypassable as well, but I leave it on because it sounds good to me. It's got a headphone output, which I use. It's also got a monitor input, which I use to plug like my iPhone into it if I want to jam along with music and things like that. And then you can set the blend between the iPhone level and the overall headphone mix. So if I want more iPhone, I get it here, less, and then overall volume of the headphone out. And the balanced DIs are hearing the cab simulated output. On the back of the rack interface, it has an additional pair of unbalanced 1/4-inch outputs, stereo outputs, that don't have the cab simulation on it, so you can run it into a power amp and cabinets without having to have an additional cab simulation circuit on top of that. So that's very handy. Let's see. This also has a wah circuit and a stereo VCA circuit on the back, which I've used the wah, but I don't like the sound of it. It's kind of not that great. The VCA I haven't used before because I've got a volume pedal in my pedal board. So, but it's pretty cool because they're both the wah and the VCA are controllable via expression pedals, So that's kind of a nice feature. So you don't have to run, if you didn't want to use a normal wah and you wanted to do it through the rack, you wouldn't have to run your signal all the way to the front of the stage and then back like the traditional wah dilemma. This MIDI through has a phantom power send on it so that I can just connect my MIDI foot controller straight into that. And then the back of this rack interface has an additional phantom power input. So you can just power it from the rack and not have to run a wall wart here. Although currently I'm running my ground control foot controller into the GCX because it also has phantom power sending from its MIDI jack. So that's handy because this was actually built for this. They're both the same company, right? But in the past, when I didn't have the GCX, I used that jack and it was wonderful. The other cool thing is the rack interface is powered via the power station. And so rather than having to use a wall wart, it uses a tiny little barrel connector. So I eliminate the wall wart from here. And the power station also powers the GCX. And it also powers the Korg. So I eliminate 3 wall warts from the rack and the weight associated with that, which is really cool. So beyond that, I've got the DL 8000R delay, which is like the sick stereo input. It's like a 2290. It's got all kinds of chorusing effects on it. It sounds amazing. Of course, the PCM80, which I had modified for the maximum delay time. I've also got the pitch effects card in it and the dual effects card standing by. I also did the battery compartment modification on it so that you can just slip a battery in and out of it super easy. Not that you have to very often, but it's nice to be able to do it that way instead of the other way, which is all soldered in and weird. And then, of course, my G-Force, which I've had forever. and I still love some of the sounds in it. Simple. And that's about it. Cool. All right. Aloha.